Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. Now, we all love a good quote, those short, sharp lines that capture something true about life. But have you ever wondered why some of them stick with us? Why do a few well-chosen words change how we think, make decisions, or even face risk? My guest on this episode is James Geary. He's a writer, journalist, and lifelong collector of... And here's where I need to admit something. I wasn't entirely sure how to pronounce this word because, as far as I was concerned, it was either aphorism or aphorism. And if I'm being even more honest, before I spoke to James, I wasn't even really sure what one was. But fortunately, he does know. In fact, he spent decades collecting them, studying why humans have been drawn to these compact sentences that hold enormous meaning. And you'll find them everywhere from the ancient world to social media, acting as tiny tools for thinking. In our discussion, James and I explore what makes aphorisms or aphorisms work, why contradiction and humour matter, and how a single sentence can be both philosophy and survival strategy. We also talk about his newly updated book, The World in a Phrase, which traces these miniature masterpieces through time. So if you've ever found yourself quoting a line to make sense of a situation, or wondered how just a handful of words can hold so much wisdom, this episode is for you. It's my discussion with James Geary on the art of, I'll leave it up to you, aphorisms or aphorisms. James, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm thrilled to have you here because you have I don't know if it's a hobby or a passion, but either way, we're going to find out more about it, which is that you are obsessed with, is probably the right word, actually, I think, for you are obsessed with. And I said to you before we started recording, I don't know how to pronounce this word, so I'm going to deviate between aphorism and aphorism. Either way, how does one get interested in those?
I always say aphorism, so I'm going to stick with that. You're right. It is an obsession. And I think, well, aphorisms are the oldest written art form on the planet. So 3000 BCE, ancient China, ancient Egypt, the first forms of writing were actually receipts, 1,000 bushels of grain purchased by one emperor or another. But the oldest form of literature is the aphorism. So it's been around since human beings have been around. And before there was writing, it was shared verbally. So I think we live amongst aphorisms. So like every family has a little catchphrase that Uncle Joe used to say or Aunt Mary used to say. But I discovered them in the pages of Reader's Digest when I was 8 years old. My parents subscribed to 2 magazines, and those were the only things to read in our house. And we didn't have books. One was Reader's Digest, the other was Time magazine. I eventually ended up working for Time magazine as a journalist that I discovered aphorisms in Reader's Digest. The quotable quotes section, which is a page in every issue, where they just had a list of quotes, usually by celebrities, like, if you marry for money, you'll earn every penny. But something as an 8-year-old just kind of clicked for me when I started reading these little phrases. And I still remember the very first one that I read. The difference between a rut and a grave is the depth. And I don't know why we're laughing, because that's a pretty dismal aphorism. And I was 8 years old, so I had no idea in the world what an aphorism was, and probably didn't understand what that particular aphorism meant at the time. But I knew there was something special about it. It just captured my imagination. And I was an early reader. I loved to read and I loved to write. And something about, compressing so much meaning into a single sentence and being able to kind of let yourself loose inside that sentence and explore what it means and think about what it means. I just found them fascinating. And you're absolutely right. It's been an obsession since I was 8 years old. And that obsession, for better or for worse, is The World in a Phrase, a brief history of the aphorism.
Before we started recording, I mentioned to you that my friend James Victore has a quote, and I think this is probably one helpful as a sort of entry point to illustrate what they are. But secondly, I wanted to use this to, one, see if it describes you, but two, maybe we can use this as an illustration of the tests that you apply, because there are definitions out there, but you define it by looking at sort of 5 criteria. So if I read you this quote, and you can then maybe take us through that and tell me whether this qualifies as an aphorism. And James's quote is, "The things that made you weird as a kid make you great today," which I think sums up beautifully you.
um, well, yes, I think aphorisms are a bit weird, and it's certainly a weird interest for a child to have. I would say that's definitely an aphorism. So the five laws are: it must be brief, so it's brief. It must be personal, and that's to say it must have like an identifiable author. And aphorisms are very characteristic of the personality of the author. So like the difference between like "let sleeping dogs lie," that is a proverb, because the identity of the author has been worn away. We don't know who first said that, but whoever first said it at the time it was said, it was an aphorism. And because the author is lost, it's a proverb. The other laws are: it must be definitive, must be philosophical, and it must have a twist. And so that quote from your friend meets all those five laws, and it's got that twist at the end with like, adult, child. There's a sort of parallel structure. What makes you weird is what makes you great. And I think that's also that sentiment or that kind of approach is very characteristic of aphorisms, because they are very idiosyncratic. They're a little bit strange. They're a little bit ornery. And like I said earlier, what makes them so compelling is that they're stamped with the personality of the person who came up with it.
And so obviously what wasn't in your criteria, or maybe it is implicitly, is that they have to make sense, right? They have to be true, I guess.
Yeah. So they don't have to be true. Or many things can be true at the same time. So Samuel Johnson famously said, "Patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel." Ambrose Bierce, an American writer, about 100 years later, he disagreed. He said, "Patriotism is the first refuge of a scoundrel." So those things are contradictory. Aphorisms can be contradictory. They are true in the sense that, that your podcast is about decision making and risk and things like that. So aphorisms are like heuristics. They're a method for solving problems. They're a method for making decisions. And you can depending on the circumstances, you could make a decision that is opposite of the one that you would make if the circumstances were different. So aphorisms are like that. They're situational, and they're true, and they're true for the moment to which they're speaking, but they're not. They can also be contradictory, if that makes sense, because there's a difference between being true in a kind of philosophical sense and like factually verifiable in a journalistic sense.
And I guess because they're often about, advice to navigate the world.
Yeah.
It's perfectly possible to have conflicting advice that could both be correct. Right? There's two separate paths that one could take, two interpretations of what's going on. So to your point, they're not. It's not necessarily. Yeah, I guess it's interesting that it's not necessarily about the truth. It's just it's something, I guess, that has some validity somewhere. There's some sort of usefulness.
Yeah, and I think that's when I say they must be philosophical, I don't mean like a kind of abstract, esoteric philosophy. I mean like philosophy of daily life. Like what is the oldest philosophical questions? Who am I? Why am I here? What is the good life? How do I live? Aphorisms are like little instruction manuals for getting through a rough day at the office or a dark night of the soul. And they provide that sort of, they're like signposts. There's a great Polish aphorism: "The most difficult thing is to find the way to the signposts." and I always think of that like when I'm like really confused about something. I don't know what decision to make. I don't know which way to turn. I always think of that. It's like once you're on the path, once you're on the road, okay, it's easy. There's the signpost, London, 60 kilometers ahead. It's getting to those signposts. It's finding those signposts. And that's the real, there's another great one. Life is like playing the violin in public and learning the instrument as one goes along. And that's what life is like, right? Every day we're thrown into these situations that we didn't anticipate, didn't expect, and really don't know how to solve. But aphorisms give you those little pointers.
And so the 8-year-old you that's discovered this joyful thing, you do to tell the story about what you do with them on your bedroom wall, because I think this is I loved it because it was so counterintuitive, which fits what James said. But just tell us a little
Yeah.
bit about that.
Sure. I started reading them when I was 8. And then when I was a teenager, like 12, 13, 14, I started like reading novels and reading books and things like that. And I started to collect them. And I had, like a lot of teenagers, I had posters of rock stars of my era on my bedroom walls: Pink Floyd, David Bowie, George Harrison. Um, and I didn't know how do you collect aphorisms? You know, you have to have a really good memory, or you have to write them down somehow. And I wanted to be like, I also kept a journal and things like that as an aspiring writer as a teenager, but I wanted to be surrounded by aphorisms. Like, they're always in my head. And so I always feel like I'm living in a cloud of aphorisms, but I wanted to be surrounded by them. So I turned the George Harrison post, I took it down, turned it around. So George Harrison was facing the wall. Sorry, George. And then, put it back up, and I started writing, just scrolling. Every time I'd come across a great aphorism, I'd write it on the poster. And I did that for David Bowie. I did that for Pink Floyd. And I still have these posters. They're like all kind of crumbling around the edges and torn from where so much adhesive tape was attached and then removed. But they're like the signposts. I'm sitting in my study and I can look up and I'll see these posters that I started compiling, 50 years ago. And that's how I find the way to the signposts.
And so this is just a kid trying to make sense of it. So there's some joy in it, but it sounds like it's sort of you trying to make sense of the world as well.
Yeah, but it's also joyful. I'm glad you mentioned that, because like, suddenly aphorisms about life are popping into my head. Life is a maze in which we take the wrong turn before we have ever learned to walk. that's, that's also like, it's also like it's a dark aphorism. But it's also super funny, and it's darkly humorous. And part of what I love about aphorisms is they are so much fun. They're joyful. And your friend's aphorism about being weird, what made you weird as a kid, they're playful, just like kids are playful. And that's how we learn. That's how kids learn. They play, they try stuff, and they keep repeating that. And then they see what happens, and that's how they learn. And I think aphorisms are like that. They're totally super, super serious, but they're playful at the same time. And they teach. They're educational in that sense, but they teach through paradox, and they teach through humor. And I think especially, the darkest, a lot of aphorisms are very, very dark. There's a great contemporary Polish aphorist, who's one of her aphorisms is, if the future knew what was coming, it would never have arrived. And it's like,
it's quite apt for nowadays, right?
Totally apt for nowadays. Look at all the stuff that's going on politically, environmentally, militarily. There's lots of terrible, terrible things going on in the world. And an aphorism like that is not taking them seriously. It's taking them very seriously, but approaching them with a kind of levity and kind of resilience that I think helps you cope with challenging times. So part of the function of the humor in aphorisms is, I think, to help you cope, because a lot of the stuff that's going on in the world today is really, really dark.
And of course, that levity, as you put it, helps, I guess. It sort of makes sometimes the dark content and the dark message easier to manage, but it also makes it more memorable.
Yeah, totally. And memorability is really, really crucial. Why can angels fly? Because they take themselves lightly. And I think that's why, like, the earliest aphorists, like the Buddha, Muhammad, Jesus. They were all aphorists. They spoke their aphorisms. They didn't write them down. Like one of the Buddha's great sayings is, "We are what we think," and it's so succinct. It's so concise, and because aphorisms emerged in an oral culture, you have to remember them somehow. And the cleverness with which they're phrased and the imagery that they use is what makes them memorable. And we all of us are walking around with these little aphorism anthologies in our heads. Even if we've never heard the term aphorism or aphorism, however you pronounce it, even if you never heard that term, there's still, like, every family has sayings that it lives by. I remember I did a talk one time, and a woman came up to me afterwards, and like she was just like you. She had this saying, and she wanted to know if it was an aphorism.
Right,
And
you're the sort of, I don't know, approver in chief, I guess.
Yes, I'm the.
Does
what
it
is
make
that
it
show?
through? Right, yeah.
I'm the official judge of aphoristic hood or something. But uh, and she was saying, "Oh, is this an aphorism? Because this is a saying that's been in my family for generations." And so I said, "Well, what is it?" And she said, "If you're not living on the edge, you're taking up too much space." And yeah, that is a great aphorism. But that's what I mean is, like, every family, every group, if you're I'm a journalist, journalists have their sayings that they share with each other, lawyers, doctors, teachers, people from the same ethnic group, people from the same neighborhood, people from the same family. We all kind of are walking around with these little instructions for living in the form of aphorisms that we just kind of picked up along the way or passed down from generation to generation. And it's partly the humor, it's partly the clever wordplay that makes them so memorable. But it's also like, in case of emergency, pull this lever. That's aphorisms are like that too. If you're in a crisis, certainly it's true for me. When you're in a crisis, or when I'm in a crisis, I'll speak for myself here, aphorisms pop into my head. I was made redundant once a long time ago, and that kind of was not totally unexpected, but still came as a shock and created all kinds of financial terror and other things. And when it first happened, I remember an aphorism from Wilhelm Eklund, who's a Swedish aphorist. And it goes, to be placed on treacherous ground is good, because it's only when the ground is trembling beneath us that we learn to stand on our own 2 feet. And I found that super comforting at a time of great uncertainty and anxiety. But also the thing about aphorisms, they're inspirational, but they don't solve your problems for you, right? You still have to do it yourself. But even like I had to figure out a way, I had to find my way to the signposts after being made redundant. But that Wilhelm Eklund saying, although it didn't do anything for me practically, it did give me this sort of psychological solid ground to think, okay, I'm going to deal with this and I'm going to be fine.
And it sounds like it's sort of a little bit like people turn to religious scriptures like the Bible, and obviously there will be those in the Bible, as you've mentioned.
Absolutely.
Jesus as a good example.
Yeah.
But you're turning to it as a sort of, I guess, partly to sort of somebody else has been through not necessarily the exact situation, but you take comfort from the fact that I'm not the first person to experience these emotions, and so that sort of doesn't make me feel alone. I know there's, but also I have some sense of it's manageable, or there's a path there, whether or not the path is pointed out to you. So you're getting succor from it, I guess.
Absolutely. There's a great saying by Blaise Pascal, a French aphorist, 16th century, 17th century. And it's about writing. And he says, and he uses the metaphor of tennis for some reason. He says, we're all talking about writers of aphorisms in particular. He says, we're all hitting the same ball, but some of us place it better than others. And that's the essence of tennis, isn't it? You're just hitting the same ball back and forth, but where you place it is the key. And that's what makes it special. So yeah, we've all been this way before. And aphorists aren't saying there's nothing new under the sun. Ecclesiastes, since you mentioned the Bible, aphorists are saying stuff that people have been saying for millennia, but it's the way they say it. It's how they place that ball that gives it a kind of freshness and new relevance also, to speak to your contemporaries. But aphorisms written 5,000 years ago are as relevant as aphorisms today, and they're talking about the same thing. And so yeah, it's like, certainly for me, the aphorisms are sacred scriptures, and I can find them in sacred scriptures of religions around the world, Buddhism to Christianity to the Jewish faith, Muslim faith. There's great aphorisms everywhere in religious texts, but they're also secular. It's also a secular. Can I say that? Secular religion? That's an oxymoron.
You just have, and I'm up for that. That's fine by me.
So that reminds me, like Thomas Jefferson, one of the founders of the American Republic. He had this project at the end of his life where he went through the New Testament, and he, with a razor, with a physical copy, as one does, yes, with physical copies of the book, and he cut out all the sayings of Jesus that he thought were authentic and that he thought were original. And they were all kind of moral sayings. He didn't include anything about miracles. He didn't include anything about founding a church. He only included the sayings that had to do with your personal conduct in the world that Jesus said. And it's called, and this text survived, and it's called now the Jefferson Bible. And it was for him, he didn't agree with everything in the New Testament. So he kind of composed his own New Testament, just with the stuff that he thought felt right to him. And we all do that. We're all constructing our own. I wouldn't maybe call it a Bible, but we're all constructing our own aphorism anthologies as we go through life. And remembering the advice of a mentor, or the comforting words of a friend, or the guidance of a parent, and that those stick in our heads, and they help us. Well, we need to pull that emergency lever, there they are.
And do you ever find, because I imagine it's now part of what you are, and that's how your brain works. Do you ever find yourself not having one and going and either seeking one out or creating one yourself to fill that gap? Because I imagine, given the way you look at the world and the amount of time you spend looking at this topic, that there probably wouldn't theoretically be a part of human existence that isn't covered by one somewhere. Are you having to plug gaps, or are you fully covered?
No, I'm fully covered. It's sometimes.
Or is that because you're not living on the edge and therefore you haven't taken?
No, it's sometimes I think I've thought of something new, and then I'll realize, oh shit, no, sorry.
That's okay. Swear away. It's all good. It's all good.
Someone's already said that, or someone's already written that, but that it doesn't matter to me. It's not what makes, even though we all face its birth, its love, its hate, its death, its suffering, its joy. These are things that human beings have been experiencing for millennia, and hopefully will continue to experience for millennia more. Those experiences are the same if looked at one way, but the fact that it's happening to me is totally original, totally new, totally unrepeatable. The fact that it's happening to you is totally new, totally original, totally unrepeatable, and for all your listeners. So we're going through the same things, but we're going through it uniquely. And I think that's where aphorisms come in. They're talking about these millennia old dilemmas we face, crises, situations, experiences, but it's that twist. And that's why the fifth law of the aphorism, it must have a twist. And that's the twist that brings the freshness and the idiosyncrasy to it that that makes that kind of, even though it's the same, it's new every time.
And so the twist is important because it takes you somewhere not obvious. Because if it was obvious, you'd have worked it out for yourself. So the point is, it's taking you somewhere that you might. There's a joy in it, right? There's a sort of suspense where I was thinking about it as sort of ball bouncing off a wall. It bounces off in an unpredictable direction, so we don't see it coming. And I guess that's part of the one, again, back to making it memorable, but also that's why it's useful, right? It's not sort of a statement of the blindingly obvious. It does have to provoke some sort of insight.
Yeah. And the statement of the blindingly obvious, those are the things you find in greeting cards, right?
Not the kind I buy, but I know what you mean.
Right. I'd like to read some of your greeting cards then. But no one looks at a greeting card, reads a greeting card and think, wow, man, wow, that's stunning. Never thought of that before. That's just, there's no original placement of the ball, to quote Pascal again. It's just, that's the same ball hitting it in the same way. And it's just not interesting. And it's also not authentic. It's not genuine. And that's part of it's personality less, which is one of the laws. It must be personal. But a true aphorism does have that twist. So one just popped into my head. I think it's Ralph Waldo Emerson. A hero is no braver than an ordinary person, but a hero is braver 5 minutes longer. And that's one I also think about a lot. It's like, we're all the same. And in our personal lives, in our social lives, in our relationships, you get thrown into situations like that scare you to death or are super uncertain. And, I started this business and it's not going well. Should I bail? I started this relationship and it's not going well. Should I bail? I went back to university and it's not going well. Should I bail? Well, maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't. But the difference between the hero and the ordinary person is not the amount of bravery you have. It's the level of persistence that you're willing to apply. So I always find that a strangely comforting aphorism as well, because again, like the one we were talking about earlier, it doesn't solve any of your problems. In fact, it
creates more, right?
It creates more, or it just says, yes, you've got a problem. I would stick with it if I were you. But sometimes, that's what you need to hear. And hanging in and hanging on for 5 minutes longer. Winston Churchill, if you're going through hell, keep going. Like, what's the alternative? I'm not going to stop and stay in hell for the rest of my life, right? I got to keep going. And aphorisms are like, help you keep going.
But that's a really good illustration, right? Of on the one hand, that is great advice. On the other hand, it could, in certain circumstances, be terrible advice.
Yep.
Right.
And that's what we were talking about earlier. It's like, it's contradictory. But you will know. You will know if you need to hang on for 5 minutes longer. And if you do hang on for 5 minutes longer and things are still terrible, then maybe it is time to bail. There's another, so I'm going to misquote this one. There's a woman who like posts her poetry on lampposts and street signs in Chicago, here in America. And she writes a lot about relationships. And one of her aphorisms is, don't let someone show that they don't want you twice. And I think that's great relationship advice, right? Like the equivalent of, okay, I'm going to hang on for 5. You've just done something really that is not okay, but I'm going to hang 5 minutes longer. But if you do it again, you're done. So there's, the advice could be correct or incorrect or good or bad, but it's for you to decide in the moment. And that's the other thing, like aphorisms they're definitive. They're not like, under certain circumstances and under the following conditions, every other Wednesday before, if it's not raining, before 4. It's just like, no, this is the way it is. But they prompt, because the aphorisms are framed in this kind of definitive way, they prompt you to like, to decide for yourself, what do I agree with that? So they're not meant to, like, they don't induce like passivity and passive acceptance, but they challenge you to think through whatever the situation is that they're addressing, and then decide for yourself. Yeah, I'm going to hang on, or no, that's stupid advice. I'm not going to do that. What a terrible aphorism. So they prompt original thought. They prompt introspection. They prompt self-critical thinking.
Which of course makes them fascinating and relevant today in the sense of lots of things. I mean, there's social media. There's a tendency nowadays to sort of want quick answers to things, but also we like to be provoked and inspired, because that's a human thing. And so we'll come on and talk about the book and why you've decided to refresh it. But it's very, very, it's very du jour, for want of a better phrase. I'm sure you'll have an aphorism to help us do this, but it's feels very timely, I guess, in terms of, one, our need for advice and guidance to get us through some of these situations. But secondly, in a world of short attention spans, and our attention spans, I'm told, are getting shorter, although hour-long podcasts still do seem to be popular, so we're okay there. It's feels like it's a great time to be to have these and to focus on them and to explore them.
Yeah. So I would say, yeah, it is and it isn't. So aphorisms have been going viral for millennia, not just during the past 20 years that social media has been around.
And 20 years, wow, must be, yeah.
Oh yeah. My God. So wow. the original edition of the book came out in 2005, and one of the reasons, you just alluded to it earlier, one of the reasons it's 20 years later. One of the reasons I wanted to bring out a new edition with there's lots of new material in the book. It's like 50% of the total is new material. Because social media kind of has elevated short form communication, and aphorisms have been short form communication for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. But what you say about attention spans, I think, is crucial. Are the ways, the formats in which we communicate are becoming shorter and shorter. Whatever the 280 character limit for X, whatever it is now, I'm not on that platform, but every platform has its character limits, and we all have our character limits. That's a little pun I just threw in there.
Very good.
No extra charge. But the short form communication does not equal a short attention span. So Marie von Ebner-Eschenbach, an Austrian aphorist, one of her aphorisms is, an aphorism is the last link in a long chain of thought. And so aphorisms may be short, but they make you think for a very, very long time. And like that, the difference between a rut and a grave, which I read more than 50 years ago for the first time, I'm still thinking about it. I still kind of turn it over in my head. It still pops up in my mind under certain circumstances. So the form is short, but the intellectual engagement of an aphorism it's long form. It's the shortest literary form, but it's the kind of has the longest shelf life in terms of the kind of thought processes that it instigates. And so social media in some respects is the perfect delivery mechanism for aphorisms. But in other respects, social media is the most unaphoristic medium that there is, because aphorisms are not rage posts, they're not rants. They're not just kind of hot takes. Aphorisms are crafted, they're thought deeply about. And some aphorists kind of write them spur of the moment and they come out fully formed. Others spend a long, long time whittling down pages into paragraphs and paragraphs into a single sentence. And I think one way that aphorisms really speak to our time is that they do aphorisms do provoke contemplation, consideration, thinking things through, not shouting other people down. And I think if aphorisms can provide a service to our current, social discourse, it's to provide really provocative thoughts, but in a way that encourages introspection, in a way that encourages dialogue, and in a way that is not like rabidly partisan. Aphorisms are very, very opinionated. Of course they are. But like I said earlier, they provoke critical thinking in the reader. And so you're engaged in dialogue with the aphorist. And it's for you to decide if you agree or disagree, follow that advice or don't follow it. And that's as it should be. The dialogue, I think, is what's missing in a lot of cases today.
And that process that you described there of sort of reflecting and honing it down so that the message, I mean, that's got parallels in the 21st century with copywriters, for example, for advertising. And this idea of sort of, I guess you kind of know when you've nailed it, when you've got it to the best it possibly can be, at least in your thought process. Someone else may be able to improve on it. But that's really what you're sort of pointing towards. And that craft, I guess, is deployed to sell us things. It's deployed to convince us of things for propaganda purposes. But it's the same thing, right? It's how do we distill through a message to people? And that's not always quick and easy process. It can take time and refinement. And so I loved it. And in the book, and once you it was one of those beautiful things. But once you pointed out, it was blindingly obvious. But it really surprised me was you made reference, for example, to the way Ukraine, since the Russian invasion, has been using social media to get message across. And there's a lovely quote which I noted down, which is, "We kneel before heroes, not invaders."
Yeah.
And I just thought, what a great thing. And maybe you want to talk a little bit about the context around that, because you'll do a better job of it than I will. But I just thought recognizing this not as an ancient art form, but actually, well, it is one, but it's also got very 21st century applications.
Yeah. No, that's a great example. Thanks for mentioning it. The the Ukrainian government has a X account, formerly Twitter, and they use that to get out information about the war and Russia's full-scale invasion and all the things that a government does. But they also use it aphoristically to basically, it's a sort of the philosophical front of the war against Russia. And the example you just gave was something they posted around the 80th anniversary of D-Day. And there was an American soldier in a wheelchair at the event. And President Zelensky was also there. And they were introduced. And the American soldier in the wheelchair, he kind of grabbed President Zelensky's hand and went to kiss it. And Zelensky you can do a search and you can see the video. It's very, very moving. And President Zelensky then knelt, because the American soldier, he must have been close to 100, I think. And he was in a wheelchair. So President Zelensky knelt beside him. And they had this wonderful exchange about the American soldier saying, "You are saving Europe." And Zelensky saying to him, "No, you saved Europe." It was a really moving encounter. And then the at Ukraine X account posted a video of that with the phrase that you mentioned: "We kneel before heroes, not invaders." And that is just an absolutely devastating, just a devastating blow against Russia in the form of this kind of moral, the moral right of Ukraine defending itself against this brutal invasion. And it's also an inspirational message, and it's in the form of an aphorism. And this is another area where social media is helping the aphorism evolve, because it involves not just words, but images. And I think that is something that's new with social media and just in the past 20 years, that you can now combine words with images and distribute them really, really easily. And I think what the Ukrainian X account is doing is using aphorisms to take jabs at their enemy, but also to inspire their supporters, to show a scene like that with two heroes kneeling to each other and, by implication, standing up to the invader. It's just super inspiring. And it's a great example of how aphorisms can give you this kind of like, yeah, when you're going through hell, keep going. And an aphorism like that helps you keep going.
But it's a really interesting illustration because there's the sort of conventional wisdom of picture is worth or speaks 1,000 words. But what you've just outlined is how words can enhance a picture. And so it's almost like the superiority of the image is implicit in the picture speaks 1,000 words, but actually there's something powerful about the words. And I'm really struck as you're talking about the softness of these things. I mean, they deal with very, very harsh topics, but there's a calmness to We Kneel Before Heroes, Not Invaders, which is
Yeah.
totally at odds with the subject matter, and yet is entirely in keeping. And it feels very, as you say, it's not the sort of shouty social media, but it's incredibly powerful.
Yeah. There's a courage in We Kneel Before Heroes, Not Invaders. There's a kind of sense of defiance and resolution and resilience. And that speaks to an inner strength of Ukraine, of the Ukrainian people. And it's also, there's been lots in America, around the world, debates about free speech. What can you say? What can't you say? And in America recently, late night comedians have been highlighted as saying things that parts of the American government and parts of the American country don't think they should be saying. But that's what the kind of pointedness of the aphorism and its kind of calm strength is what people who don't support free speech find so infuriating about the form, because aphorisms they've always been about not dissent, but freedom of speech. Like we were talking about earlier, you can have an aphorism that advises you to do one thing, and there's going to be an aphorism that advises you to do the other thing. That's what aphorisms are about, the free exchange of ideas, the kind of constructive confrontation of ideas. But that's what people who don't believe in free speech can't stand about aphorisms, because they do embrace that openness, to open inquiry, defiance of authoritarianism. And I think that's what makes them so inspiring.
And we've started to talk about the book, so we should absolutely cover that, because it was a gripping read. Tell us about the structure, because I imagine that there could be a temptation just to write, almost to put your posters in book form. Right, here are my favourite ones, and you chose not to do that and instead write a history. And I'm intrigued as to what got you to the point of wanting to do that rather than just your favourites.
Right. It's a good question, because I think there's like 64. So the book is a history, and it's structured chronologically from the beginning of the aphorism, like 3000 BCE with the ancient Chinese and ancient Egyptians, and it goes right up to the present day. And it's written in the form of individual short sections about individual aphorists from throughout history. And I think I can tell you I'll tell you how it all came about. So when this book first came out in 2005, it was my second book. And my first book was a popular science book. And that first book came and went, and nobody but me and my parents noticed. So it was a dismal commercial failure, and it was kind of crushing. I was crushingly disappointed in the way that it was received, if I can even use the word received, since so few people received it. It was super disappointing. And I remember sitting in despair in my study, and all I've ever wanted to do since I was 8 was be a writer. And I remember sitting in my study, just completely dejected. These books are really hard; they take a long time, and it's really disappointing if nobody notices when they when they appear. And I just was thinking, like, what am I going to do? This is all I ever wanted to do in my life, and I failed. And I looked around my room and I saw my aphorism posters. And I said, I'm going to write a history of the aphorism, because that's what I love. And that's what really inspires me. And so it just kind of, in a way, it is my posters in book form, but it's not a selection of my favorites. It's my assessment of like who are the most crucial aphorists throughout history. And I felt like that was the story that I wanted to tell, because that's the story that has been like that's been the story of my like writerly life since I was 8. But I also have a second book about aphorisms, which is an encyclopedia and an anthology. So it has way more. I think that has like 350 aphorists in it, and this just has 64. So I've been finding different ways to expand those posters and get them into book form. But it's the history that I find so, because you can read like from the I Ching, which is the ancient Chinese book of changes, which is like 5,000 years ago was compiled. And that is as resonant and relevant today as it was then. And then reading an aphorism by like the Polish aphorist I mentioned with the aphorism about the future. It's like, we've been doing this all this time, and it's still so much fun, and it's still fresh, and it's still so lively. And that was a story that had never been told before. And so that's how that came about.
And the refresh, was that your idea? Did the publisher come back to you? What prompted the refresh?
No, that was my idea. So the book went out of print some years ago. And that's also a very distressing experience for an author, because when your book goes out of print, only like people can only get used copies. No new copies are being printed. But if that happens to an author after a certain period of time, the rights revert back to you as the author. And so the rights reverted back to me, and I realized, and it's like what I was saying earlier, I still love this stuff. This is still what I'm enthusiastic about when I wake up, and I'm still collecting aphorisms. And it was 20 years ago that the book came out. I've collected a lot more aphorisms since then, and especially the more contemporary aphorists. And like we were talking about earlier, I wanted to explore how the aphorism had and hadn't changed given social media, and the huge influence that social media has on our culture and will continue to have, for good and for ill. And so there was partly a practical, that was like a practical, timely motivation to do it. But it was also just like, I still love this stuff. And I got a bunch more aphorisms that I didn't know about 20 years ago. And I just wanted to put them in. And so that's what I did. And I'm going to do that for the encyclopedia as well. I'm already working on that. And that'll be like 600 aphorists by the time I'm done.
Wow. And is it, when you look at sort of writing history, because I would imagine, because this is probably me projecting, but I would imagine that when you're writing history, it's very tempting to put your favorites in there. Was it obvious which ones were historically significant, or because you it's sort of, it is possible to twist things. So this is very important because, was that an easy distinction for you to make, or was there a big overlap there? How did that work?
I'm sure people will disagree with some of my choices. Like, for example, Oscar Wilde he's in my encyclopedia, but he's not in The World in a Phrase. And I would imagine a lot of people would be surprised, and some might even be offended by that.
Astonishing what offends people, but yeah, you're right. Yeah.
I think Oscar Wilde is a wonderful writer, wonderful aphorist. For me, he's not like one of the key historical figures, but there are other ones, the other aphorists whom I feel are key figures, even though they're not widely known. So another example is another Polish aphorist, Stanisław Lec, who was active during the Soviet period in the 50s and 60s. And he was a dissident, although at one point in his life, he did work for the Communist Party, but later on, he became a dissident. And he used to publish his aphorisms in the newspaper, but he was never censored because the censors had no idea what he was talking about because his aphorisms were so clever and they used lots of like metaphorical language and things like that. And the censors like, what? I don't even know what the hell this guy's talking about. So it can't be anything political, but it was very political. And one of my favorites of his is no snowflake in an avalanche ever feels responsible.
I love that one because I wrote that down because I just thought that's amazing.
So that is, I think Stanisław Lec is one of the all-time greatest aphorists, anytime, any country. But he's very well known in Poland and in Central Europe. But he's only had two like very thin books translated into English, and that was like in the 70s. So he's not very well known, but in my opinion, he is one of the key figures. And there's other aphorists like that who, or even some people who like people might not even regard them as an aphorist. Like Dr. Seuss, the American children's author. I grew up reading his books, and they're the most, one fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish, the most simple, obvious rhymes, but he's an aphorist. And some of his couplets are just incredibly powerful aphorisms for like young people or people who are young at heart. The same kind of advice about how to get through challenging times. So other people like Emily Dickinson, she's a great poet, one of the great poets of America. She's also an aphorist. There's a guy, a Mauritian, Malcolm de Chazal, who, again, very few people have ever heard of, but in my opinion, he's one of the great aphorists of all time.
Obviously, one of the fascinating things is these can appear anywhere. I mean, you've mentioned there's the Bible, Dr. Seuss is another good example, Twitter/X, social media, another one. It must be fascinating for you because this isn't a sort of the kind of research where if you're researching drama, you'd be looking at a very defined set of works. Presumably, you can come across these things anywhere, and you must have an antenna for these things, and because I think the Reader's Digest story is a great example, right? That's sort of. I'm probably maligning Reader's Digest, but I'm going to do it anyway. It's not the most highbrow thing, at least from what I can remember. I haven't looked at it, but they're perfectly valid there. And so this can appear in all sorts of different, and I guess it can appear in marketing and all sorts of other areas. So we're surrounded by this stuff in many respects. That must be quite, I guess, fascinating for you because you could stumble across it anywhere. Yeah. Equally, if you're trying to research it, it's not obvious where to look necessarily all the time.
You have to look everywhere. So, I don't think you're insulting Reader's Digest by describing it as not highbrow. Aphorisms are not highbrow. Some people there's a certain kind of person who thinks because many of the most famous aphorists were 17th century French nobility, that the aphorism is this very elite form. It's not. Ordinary people have been making and using aphorisms all the time. And it's the most democratic form because you didn't have to be literate to hear and understand an aphorism or make one up. So aphorisms are not a highbrow form. They're the opposite of that. They're the most democratic. And by democratic, I don't mean that in a political sense. I mean, available to everyone all the time, accessible. And you're right, they're everywhere. They're on bumper stickers, they're on baseball caps, they're on T-shirts. I once saw this great T-shirt, a young, I think he must have been a teenager, highly pierced teenager. And the T-shirt said, a weekend wasted is not a wasted weekend.
Which
And
I kind of love a stoner logic. It's
yeah,
perfect. It's
those are words to live by, at least for a weekend. And advertisements, you mentioned earlier, marketing and things like that. There are many, many similarities between advertisements and aphorisms. And the best, in my opinion, the best advertisements also work as aphorisms. And my favorite ad that's an aphorism of all time is for Muller yogurt, and it's lick the lid of life. And I just think that is so it's like a contemporary twist on seize the day, that ancient Roman adage. And like that's, yeah, lick the lid of life. And it's very literary. It's got that alliterative L, and it just rolls off the tongue. And I think, the most, I think advertisements are successful to the extent that they like approach the status of an aphorism.
So we're bending your rule slightly in the sense of you don't know who wrote it, but you'll put the yogurt's fine. That's close enough, right?
Yeah, Muller Yogurt is the author of that. Yeah, we can. The laws are elastic enough to allow
accommodate that, right? Yeah, it'd be a shame if that wasn't allowed in for the sort of fundamentalist reason. And I'm, obviously the thing that everybody's talking about now is AI. And I'm intrigued as to your experiences of that and whether it's capable of producing things that you would include, recognizing that it would also fail your author test. Is AI able to produce these things?
Oh yeah, it is. AI can produce, it can produce anything. It's astonishing what it can produce. Like the most difficult, like a villanelle is a form of a poem that has this like rhyme scheme and alternating lines, things like that. Super hard to write. I couldn't write one to save my life. AI can write great villanelles, and AI can write aphorisms too. And some of them suck. But then again, some aphorisms written by human beings suck. So it's not like the question is for me with AI is not like, can AI write a better aphorism than me? I really, it doesn't interest me if it can or it can't. What interests me is like, what can I alone as an individual with one life to live? What can I do that AI cannot do? And that's like aphorisms, like we were talking about earlier. They're all about thinking for yourself. They're all about like grappling with big ideas, with big issues, with big crises in your life. And that's what I want to do. I don't want AI to have all that fun that I could be having if I'm writing and reading my own aphorisms, if I'm facing and solving my own problems. So I'm not at all like an anti-AI person, but I do worry that if there's been lots of studies on AI that when it's used in writing tasks, and I teach writing to, graduate students. And it would be very easy, and thousands of students are doing this every day. Just whatever the assignment is, put it in AI, and there's the paper. And if you do that, you're not even engaging at all with the assignment or thinking about it. You're not thinking at all. And so they've studied some studies of using AI in this way, and one of the conclusions is it can induce cognitive laziness, which I think is such a lovely term. Cognitive laziness. I love it. If you transfer that to aphorisms, it induces metaphysical laziness. And I think we have to take responsibility for our own metaphysics. The life choices that we make, who am I? Why am I here? What is a good life? What am I supposed to be doing? What do I want to do? Those are all core metaphysical questions that aphorisms help you think through. They don't provide the answers, but they provoke you to think about the questions. And if we're not doing that, if we're offloading that onto AI, then we're not living. We're not thinking. We're not thinking our own thoughts. We're not living our own lives. We're following instructions. So for me, it's more about not is AI a better aphorist than me, but I want to have that experience myself. I want to be metaphysically fit.
But I was struck very early on. You were talking about them as prompts, and I love that because obviously prompt is a term that we now use in relation to AI. And so I'm fascinated by the idea. We spend a lot of time about how do we get the best out of the AI? How do we prompt the AI? I'm kind of interested in how we prompt the humans, which is why I think this is fascinating. It's like, how do we get people to think and not just sort of in a sort of very basic way, but actually really think about things and come up with amazing, because it seems to me the future of the species is kind of dependent on people thinking, and you know, that's how. And so I love this idea of you describing it as a prompt, because I was like, well, that's what I'm looking for. Is like, how do we prompt people? How do we get people to be?
So one way to do it is to drop that aphorism in someone's brain and let them use it as a prompt. And we have our own large language models, our brains. Not as large as ChatGPT, but large enough for us. So yeah, I think that's the real. There are many risks and many opportunities to AI, but I think on like the individual, intellectual, spiritual level, it's like outsourcing any kind of metaphysical discomfort or it's like that's challenging or difficult, and I'm not going to go there. We all need to go there, and that's where life's richness lies. If everything were easy, greeting cards would be the highest form of literature that we have.
That is a hell that I'm going to push on through. I'm not around it. Oh, James, as I knew would be the case, it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Before I let you go, I need you to remind people what the book is. I'm supposed to say where they can get it from. I always think that's obvious, but remind people what the book is called.
The book is called The World in a Phrase, A Brief History of the Aphorism.
And it is published by
University of Chicago Press, and you can get it at your local independent bookstore or online, or I guess those are the two places you can get it.
Excellent. Well, look, I have to say it was an absolutely, as people would have detected in the conversation, right? It's not going to be a boring read by any stretch of the imagination, because this is it was just super interesting, and it's clearly a passion project for you, and that just screams out of the page. I thought I needed to find an aphorism that sort of dealt with the book, and I found one, which is, "Thank you for the book. I shall waste no time reading it." However, in your case, thank you for the book. We should waste tons of time, but it's not a waste of time. It's absolutely fascinating. So thank you for writing something that's just like really thought-provoking, really interesting, but above all fun. And it's one that I think is going to sit on my bookshelf and I'll dip back into from time to time, because it's one of those beautiful books that you can read it and then you can just sort of randomly open a page and go it's like playing aphorism roulette.
Oh, right. Well, I hope the outcome is positive.
Well, it's thought-provoking either way. So
thank you for having me on, and thank you for the great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, firstly, for writing the book, but secondly, for being an absolutely brilliant guest. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to you for listening, and to James for appearing. To find out more about James and his book, The World in a Phrase, A Brief History of the Aphorism, take your pick, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. I've also included the link to my earlier conversation with James Victore, where he first shared the aphorism we discussed at the start of the episode. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk podcast, where have you been? But thank you so much for joining me. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like what you hear, please do leave a rating or review on whichever platform you're listening to the show on. It really helps other curious listeners to discover the show and for me to continue to attract high-quality guests. To discover episodes of the show that you might have missed, visit humanriskpodcast.com. I will be back very soon with another episode of the show, but in the meantime, stay safe and maybe take a moment to notice the little phrases that you live by, the things we tell ourselves and others, which often shape how we see risk, make decisions, and navigate life. But above all, thank you so much for listening.